They didn't even let him finish. The chamber of the Galactic Council, vast, luminous, filled with representatives from 100 civilizations, was built to project authority. Every voice in that room had shaped wars, ended empires, rewritten the balance of entire star systems. And yet, when the human began to speak, half of them weren't even listening. Ambassador Elias Ward stood alone at the center platform, surrounded by towering alien figures seated in concentric tiers above him. His presence was unimpressive. No guards, no fleet waiting outside, no visible leverage. Just a human. And in conclusion, he started. A soft chime cut him off. Time allocation exceeded, the Council AI announced. A few members didn't even bother to hide their disinterest. Summary sufficient, one of the delegates said. Your species has already declined formal involvement. Another added, almost lazily, your warning has been noted. Ward didn't move, didn't argue, didn't react. He simply looked around the chamber slowly, deliberately making eye contact where he could. Because, unlike them, he was paying attention. You're making a mistake, he said calmly. This time, a few more turned, not because of the words, but because of the tone. No urgency, no desperation, just certainty. A ripple of mild irritation spread through the chamber. The Council had heard warnings before, thousands of them. Most were wrong, the rest irrelevant. And what exactly are we misunderstanding, human? One of the senior counselors asked. Ward paused, not to think, to let them settle. You think this war is contained, he said. You think it's predictable, that it follows the same patterns you've studied for centuries. A faint shift in the room. Subtle, but real. It doesn't. Silence lingered a moment longer this time, but not long enough. The conflict has been modeled extensively, another voice replied. Outcomes fall within acceptable projections. Ward nodded slightly. Of course they do. That response caught them off guard. Because you're modeling it based on yourselves. That landed harder. Still, no one interrupted him now. Not because they respected him, but because something felt off. You're not facing an enemy that wants to win the war, Ward continued. You're facing one that's willing to change what war even means. That earned a few full turns now. Attention. Real attention. Too late. Humanity has chosen neutrality, the Council AI reminded. Your involvement is not required. Ward looked up at it, then back at the chamber. That wasn't a refusal, he said. A pause. It was a delay. Something shifted. Not visibly, but perceptibly, because now, they weren't just hearing him. They were starting to understand him. And why, the senior counselor asked slowly, would your species delay involvement in a galactic conflict? Ward allowed himself the smallest breath, then answered, because we needed to see how you fight. The chamber stilled, completely. And now, someone asked. Ward's expression didn't change. Now we know. The Council AI pulsed once. Your time has expired. Ward nodded. Understood. He stepped back. No protest. No escalation. Just compliance. But as he turned to leave, he added one final sentence. Quiet enough that it almost felt optional. You should have listened. This time. No one dismissed it, because for the first time, it didn't sound like a warning. It sounded like a conclusion. And somewhere, far beyond the reach of the Council, humanity had just finished preparing. The war had already been underway for 6 cycles when humanity chose to wait. Not out of fear, not out of weakness, but out of observation. Across the galaxy, the conflict between the Coalition and the Dominion had become predictable. Entire star systems burned in patterns that could be charted. Fleets moved along expected routes. Strategies repeated, refined, repeated again. To the Galactic Council, it was controlled chaos. Manageable. Containable. They had seen wars like this before. They believed they understood it. They didn't. In a quiet sector far from the primary conflict zones, humanity watched. Not with massive fleets, not with overwhelming presence, but with something far more precise. Eyes, listening posts hidden in debris fields, sensor arrays embedded in abandoned stations, deep space probes drifting silently between contested routes, every movement recorded, every decision analyzed, every mistake studied. Dr. Amina Rowe stood at the center of Earth's Strategic Analysis Command, surrounded by layered projections of the war. Hundreds of engagements replayed simultaneously in slowed time, each one broken down into patterns, probabilities, outcomes. Not to predict the war, to understand the minds fighting it. They're consistent, one analyst said, almost perfectly. Amina nodded. That's the problem. Consistency made them strong, but it also made them predictable. The Dominion relied on overwhelming force, rapid expansion, heavy strikes, relentless pressure. The Coalition relied on coordination, defensive formations, shared intelligence, calculated response. Two powerful systems, both effective, both limited. They're not adapting, another analyst observed. They are, Amina corrected, just within boundaries. She zoomed in on a specific engagement, 3 fleets colliding at the edge of a fractured system. The outcome had been decisive, efficient, clean, and entirely expected. They're solving the war, she said quietly, not changing it. That distinction mattered, because solving meant playing by the rules, and humanity had never been very good at that. Status on council request, she asked. Pending, came the reply. They're asking for confirmation of neutrality. Amina looked at the projection of the battlefield, then past it, as if seeing something beyond the data. Send acknowledgement, she said. Maintain observation. No escalation. No intervention. Just patience. Because humanity wasn't preparing to join the war. They were preparing to redefine it. And by the time the council realized the difference, it would already be too late to adapt. The first time humanity entered the war, no one noticed. There was no declaration, no fleet crossing borders, no signal broadcast across the galaxy. Just a small engagement at the edge of a collapsing system, one of thousands already unfolding across the conflict. A Dominion strike group had cornered a coalition convoy. Standard outcome. Predicted. 3 minutes to destruction. Every model agreed. The coalition ships attempted to regroup, forming defensive patterns already used dozens of times before. Their formations were precise, coordinated, and completely expected. The Dominion advanced without hesitation. They had seen this response before. They knew how it ended. So did everyone else. Back in the council chamber, the engagement was barely worth observing. Routine. Another loss. Another calculation confirmed. Then, something changed. Not dramatically. Not visibly. At first, one of the Dominion targeting systems adjusted its firing solution. Then corrected itself. Then adjusted again. A minor fluctuation. Dismissed. But it spread. Across the strike group, weapon locks began to shift by fractions barely measurable, but enough to introduce hesitation. Recalibrating, one of the Dominion officers reported. But the recalibration didn't stabilize. It multiplied. Coalition ships responded instinctively, tightening formation. But this time, the Dominion wasn't hitting where they should. Shots passed just slightly off. Close enough to feel intentional. Far enough to matter. 3 minutes became 4. Then 5. Long enough for something unexpected to happen. The convoy didn't win. It survived. Barely. But survival wasn't part of the model. Across the Council's observation systems, analysts began flagging the anomaly. Deviation detected, one voice said. With an acceptable variance, another replied. But it wasn't. Not really. Because when the data was reviewed, the error didn't originate from the Coalition. It came from the Dominion. That was new. Back on Earth, Amina Rowe watched the same engagement in silence. Phase 1 confirmed, an analyst said quietly. No celebration. No reaction. Just acknowledgement. Minimal interference, successful, another added. Amina nodded. Maintain threshold, she said. No pattern recognition, because that was the key. Not victory. Not dominance. Just disruption. Small enough to be ignored. Consistent enough to matter. And invisible enough to avoid detection. Back in the war, more engagements followed. And slowly, almost imperceptibly, the outcomes began to change. Not enough to raise alarm. Not enough to shift strategy. But enough to introduce something the galaxy hadn't experienced in a long time. Uncertainty. And where uncertainty existed, humanity was already ahead. At first, the Council called it statistical noise. A margin of error. A natural fluctuation in large-scale conflict. Because that was easier than admitting something was wrong. Across dozens of battlefronts, the same pattern began to emerge. Dominion strikes missing by fractions. Coalition defenses holding slightly longer than predicted. Engagements lasting beyond expected limits. Individually, meaningless. Collectively, impossible. But the Council didn't see it that way. Not yet. Variance within acceptable parameters, the analysis reports repeated. So the war continued. Unchanged. Or at least, that's what they believed. Because beneath the surface of those minor deviations, something far more significant was happening. The Dominion adapted first. Their doctrine shifted subtly, more aggressive targeting, faster engagement cycles, reduced reliance on predictive models. They compensated, efficiently. But that adaptation created a gap. Small, temporary, and perfectly placed. Coalition forces began exploiting openings that hadn't existed before. Maneuvers that once failed now succeeded, just enough to alter positioning, just enough to buy time. Still not victory, but no longer predictable loss. Back on Earth, Amina Rowe tracked every shift in real time. Phase 2 is stabilizing, an analyst reported. Detection risk, she asked. Minimal. They're compensating internally. Amina allowed herself a small nod. That was expected, because the objective was never to break the system. It was to let the system break itself. Expand influence zones, she said. Maintain asymmetry. Orders were executed instantly, not through fleets, through presence. Invisible layers of interference threading through targeting algorithms, navigation calculations, decision-making models. Not enough to be traced, just enough to matter. Across the war, commanders began making different choices. Not because they wanted to, but because the data suggested they should. Paths that once seemed optimal now appeared flawed. Risks that were once unacceptable now seemed viable. Slowly, the war began to change. Not in scale, not in intensity, but in behavior. Back in the council chamber, the shift finally became impossible to ignore. This is no longer random, one of the analysts said. Silence followed, because that meant something none of them wanted to say. Then what is it? A counselor asked. No one answered immediately, because every possible answer led to the same conclusion, and none of them were ready to accept it. Kelrath stepped forward. This is influence, he said. The word echoed, not attack, not invasion. Influence. From where? Someone demanded. Kelrith didn't hesitate. Humanity. The chamber reacted instantly. Dismissal. Rejection. Disbelief. But weaker this time. Because now, they had evidence. Not direct. Not visible. But undeniable. They have not deployed fleets, another counselor argued. They don't need to, Kelrith replied. That answer silenced the room. Because if that was true, then everything they understood about power was already obsolete. And out in the war, humanity took another step forward, still unseen, still unacknowledged, but no longer insignificant. The Council demanded proof. Not theory, not interpretation. Proof. Because influence without evidence was not a threat. It was speculation. And speculation did not justify changing the balance of power. Locate the source. High Arbiter, Vrax ordered. Trace it, isolate it. Simple commands. Impossible task. Across the war networks, the Council deployed everything at their disposal: deep scans, signal tracing, pattern isolation algorithms, cross-system synchronization analysis. They found nothing. No signal origin. No intrusion point. No breach. Just results. And results, without a cause, were unacceptable. They're hiding it, one of the commanders insisted. Kelrith shook his head. No, he said quietly. They're not hiding. That answer drew attention. Then explain it. Kelrith stepped forward, activating a layered projection of recent engagements. Hundreds of battles unfolded at once, each one marked by slight deviations, tiny inconsistencies. He zoomed in, then closer still, until the pattern became visible. Not in space, not in movement, in timing, milliseconds, microseconds, tiny delays introduced at critical decision points, targeting systems recalculating just slightly too late, navigation paths updating just after optimal windows, command responses arriving just beyond perfect synchronization. Not enough to fail, just enough to degrade. They're not interfering with our systems, Kelrith said. They're interfering with when our systems act. Silence fell, because that was worse. Far worse. Temporal manipulation, one of the scientists asked. Kelrith shook his head again. No, perceptual alignment. Confusion spread across the chamber. Kelrith clarified. They're not changing reality, he said. They're changing how our systems interpret it. That distinction hit harder than any attack, because it meant nothing was broken. Everything was working exactly as designed. Just slightly wrong. Back on Earth, Amina Rowe monitored the same data with calm precision. Pattern recognition risk increasing, an analyst warned. Amina considered it, then made a decision. Proceed to Phase 3. The room shifted. Not in panic, in focus. Because Phase 3 wasn't about influence anymore. It was about revelation. Scale, the analyst asked. Amina's eyes remained on the projection. Controlled exposure, she said. Let them see it. Back in the council chamber, they did. All at once. Across every monitored battlefront, the pattern synchronized. Not hidden anymore. Not subtle. Clear. Deliberate. Undeniable. Targeting delays aligned. Navigation errors mirrored. Command desynchronization repeated across fleets that had never interacted. Impossible. Unless it was intentional. This is coordinated, one of the counselors whispered. No one disagreed, because now, for the first time, they weren't questioning if humanity was involved. They were questioning how long it had been happening. Vrax turned slowly. Why reveal it now? He asked. No one answered. Because the answer was already there. the same answer Elias Ward had given them cycles ago. They had been watching, learning, waiting, and now they were finished. Back in the war, the next engagement began, and this time, the outcome wasn't just uncertain, it was controlled. The moment humanity chose to enter the war, everyone felt it. Not as a signal, not as an arrival, but as a shift. Across every battlefield, something changed at the same time. The subtle inconsistencies, the minor delays, the quiet disruptions that had defined the conflict for cycles stopped completely. For the first time in a long time, everything worked perfectly. Targeting systems aligned with absolute precision. Navigation calculations executed without delay. Command chains synchronized flawlessly. It was flawless. And that was the first sign something was wrong. Back in the council chamber, confusion spread instantly. What happened? One of the analysts asked. No one had an answer. Because perfection was not natural. Not in war. Not at this scale. Vrax leaned forward slightly, watching the incoming data streams. They've stopped, he said. Kelrith shook his head slowly. No. A pause. They've finished. Before anyone could respond, the next engagement began. A Dominion assault fleet engaged a coalition stronghold near a fractured binary system. Standard tactics, predictable movements, expected outcome. Until it wasn't. The Dominion fired first. Every shot landed exactly where it should. Perfect. Devastating. Coalition defenses began to collapse. As predicted. Then, humanity moved. Not visibly, not physically, but undeniably. Coalition ships adjusted formation. Not in reaction, in anticipation. Before Dominion weapons fired again. Defensive vectors shifted perfectly aligned with trajectories that hadn't yet been calculated. Before impact, they were already out of the way. Across the battlefield, something impossible unfolded. The Dominion wasn't missing. The coalition wasn't dodging. They were already where they needed to be. Time felt out of order. Cause and effect reversed. Decisions happening before the events that required them. What are we seeing? A counselor demanded. No one answered immediately, because there was no framework for this. Kelrith stepped forward, voice low. They're not reacting to the war anymore, he said. They're ahead of it. The implication hit instantly. This wasn't influence. This wasn't disruption. This was control. But not over systems. Over outcomes. Back on Earth, Amina Rowe watched the engagement unfold with quiet focus. Phase 4 confirmed, an analyst said. Engagement synchronization achieved. Amina didn't smile. Didn't react. Maintain spread, she said. No centralization. Because centralization meant vulnerability. And humanity had learned that lesson long ago. Across the galaxy, battle after battle began to follow the same pattern. Not domination. Not overwhelming force. Something far more precise. Humanity wasn't winning the war. They were deciding it. Quietly. Efficiently. Without ever needing to be seen. Back in the council chamber, the realization finally took hold. This isn't warfare, one of the elders whispered. Kelrith didn't look away from the projections. No, he said. A pause. This is authorship. And in that moment, the galaxy understood. The war hadn't escalated. It had changed hands. And humanity was now writing how it would end. The war did not end with the final battle. There was no decisive clash. No moment where fleets gathered for one last stand. Because by the time the galaxy realized what was happening, there was nothing left to fight. Across every front, the same pattern unfolded. Dominion offensives collapsed before reaching critical mass. Coalition defenses held where they should have failed. Entire engagements dissolved into outcomes that felt predetermined, not predicted, decided. Commanders on both sides began to hesitate, not out of fear, out of doubt, because no matter what strategy they deployed, the result never truly belonged to them. Back in the council chamber, silence had replaced authority. No debates, no directives, just observation. For the first time in its existence, the Galactic Council was not in control of a war it had approved. High Arbiter Vrax stood motionless, watching the final engagement unfold across the central projection. A Dominion flagship attempted one last offensive push. Full power, full commitment, no restraint. It never reached its target. Its path shifted, not by force, not by damage, but by decision. A decision it never chose to make. And that was when Vrax understood. Not completely, but enough. They're not ending the war, he said quietly. Kelrith didn't look at him. No. A pause. They're removing the need for it. That realization settled over the chamber like gravity. Because war, at its core, depended on uncertainty, on risk, on the possibility of victory. Humanity had removed all three, without destroying fleets, without conquering territory, without ever formally declaring their involvement. They had simply outgrown the concept of war itself. A final transmission appeared. No priority flag, no system alert, just presence. Elias Ward stood once again before the council. The same calm expression, the same steady gaze. But this time, no one interrupted him. "We told you this would happen," he said. No accusation, no anger, just truth. You believed war was something you could control. He let the silence hold. It isn't. Around him, the greatest powers in the galaxy listened, not as rulers, as witnesses. "We studied your systems," Ward continued. "Your strategies, your expectations, a step forward. And then we stepped outside of them. No resistance, no denial. Because now, they understood. You didn't lose this war," he said. Another pause. "You were made irrelevant to it." That was the final blow. Not defeat. Irrelevance. "We're not here to replace you," Ward said, "or to dominate what you built." A slight shift in tone. "We're here to ensure that what comes next doesn't repeat this." The projection flickered softly, then stabilized. "One last thing," he added, and for the first time, there was something almost human in his voice. "You should stop thinking of us as participants. A breath, because we're not playing the same game anymore." The transmission ended. No one spoke, because there was nothing left to argue, nothing left to deny. And across the galaxy, the war faded. Not with fire, not with victory, but with understanding. Humanity had not won. They had done something far more dangerous. They had changed the rules. And once that happens, there is no going back. From that moment forward, the galaxy would never see humanity as just another species. Not unpredictable, not aggressive, not even powerful in the traditional sense. They became something else. A constant, a variable that could not be modeled, a force that did not need to fight to win. Because humanity's greatest strength was never its fleets or its weapons. It was its ability to adapt, faster than anyone else could understand. And in doing so, they didn't just survive the galaxy, they redefined it.